Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations episode. I have no idea because I'm doing the responsible podcast host thing now and scheduling out episodes in advance, recording them in advance. And today I have a very special guest here on the show, Mr. Steve Kwan of BJJ Mental Models. Steve and BJJ Mental Models have been friends of BJJ Meditations since inception. Before I launched the podcast, I had a conversation with Steve about how to do this, how to make content that's useful to this community. And he's somebody whose opinion and expertise I hold in very high regard. And I'm super grateful that he would come on the podcast today and entertain the possibility of entertaining my weird questions. But there's a lot more to Steve than just the BJJ Mental Models guy. And I'm hoping to kind of get a look underneath the hood today on this podcast and take sort of not just a look at how he built BJJ Mental Models and why, but who he is and makes him tick, what makes him tick. So, Steve, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you here today.
Happy to be here, buddy. How's it going?
It's going. I just totally overhauled my training schedule again. So I'm sort of like in that weird flux state where I don't know what's up or down. But I think ultimately this will be a good trading cadence for me in this off season between competitions right now. How's it going for you?
Nice. Not bad, not bad. I'm just on the surgery wait list up here. I think I was telling you I suffered my first big jiu-jitsu injury. I managed to somehow dodge the serious stuff all the way through. Had a few little sprains here and there, but this time I tore my labrum in my shoulder. I've got at least 2 tears in there that we know of after the MRI. So I'm just going through the process of trying to find a surgeon and get that done. I'm looking forward to it. Well, not really the surgery. I'm looking forward to getting my shoulder rotation back so I can go and choke people. But that's basically what I've been up to.
Well, that's something I wanted to ask you later in our interview today is how that's going for you and specifically how it's affecting you psychologically. But we'll get more into that later. First, I kind of want to get the origin story of Steve Kwan and Jiu-Jitsu. Like, what brought you to Jiu-Jitsu in the first place, about when, and how did you find it? Because it's kind of like, I know a little bit about your background. You're a professional. I believe you were or are a software engineer or an engineer of some sort. It's amazing to me how sort of like the white collar professionals are attracted to this fight club thing, especially like when it was more of a fringy thing as short as a decade ago. So tell me a bit about how you got into the sport and what brought you to it in the first place.
Yeah, sure thing. My story of how I got into the sport is probably not that unique or exciting. I started jiu-jitsu in my mid-20s when like many people, I'd always wanted to do a martial art, but I just never really took the plunge. And at some point in my 20s, I just said, you know what? Forget it. I'm just going to do it. So I did some research. And of course, at the time in the mid-20s, research basically meant watching the UFC. So I tried to kind of scout out what would be the best martial art for me. And the thing that really appealed to me about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was just the general philosophy that it's not about size, it's not about strength, it's about leverage and fighting intelligently. And the thing that especially attracted me to Jiu-Jitsu was this idea that it's not even just about. It's funny you asked this actually because someone else just asked me this in an interview just earlier this week. But the thing about Jiu-Jitsu that's so great is it's not just about keeping yourself safe. It's also about keeping your opponent safe. If you do Jiu-Jitsu correctly, no one should get hurt, right? We don't actually want to break someone's bone or choke them unconscious. That's just the side effect of putting someone in checkmate and then something goes wrong or they don't tap out. The reason the tap is so respected and so important in jiu-jitsu is because it's kind of the glue that holds everything together. And just this idea of a self-defense art that's truly about de-escalation, not about escalation and hurting people, very unique to jiu-jitsu. Pretty much every other martial art, the idea is you damage the other person so much that they can fight no longer. And with jiu-jitsu, it's actually quite the opposite. The goal is not to fight the person. The goal is to make them stop fighting you. That really attracted me to it. So I started off in a trial class. I didn't really understand the kind of the mechanics of finding a good jiu-jitsu gym. It didn't even occur to me what a good gym was. So I just did the old thing. I, searched for jiu-jitsu in my town and I went to the top Google result and I stayed there for about a year or two. But then as I got more mature in the sport, I kind of learned that there's other options out there, found another gym that was kind of better suited for what I'm looking for and that I think culturally I aligned with better. And then, of course, I switched over, geez, not too long ago. My coach, Don Whitefield, the guy who gave me my black belt, he's much older than me. And he retired and moved off to the Bahamas. And so I needed like a new lineal coach. And so someone that I had respected greatly, who had influenced my journey greatly, and who would help the growth of my product greatly, was Emily Kwok, your coach as well, right? So a few
Yep.
years ago, I switched over under her. That's kind of the short version, I guess, of my journey, but I'm happy to unpack if there's anything else I can help discuss. Man, it's fun being the person who gets to be asked the questions rather than the person who has to ask the questions. There's much less thought about the conversation here. I can just say whatever I want. This is great.
Yeah. Yeah. I had the same feeling when the few times I've been on BJJ Mental Models as well. What year did you start?
2008, I want to say. I think
Okay.
around 2008. Yep.
So in my
as of
mind,
now, that would be 16 years.
yeah, and in my mind, that's still kind of like Wild West frontier days. You go and you watch the UFC footage from those days, and it's dated, right? And there was a grittiness and a rawness to the art that has, for better or worse, been gentrified away. So, like, how did you feel going into that arena at that time?
Geez, well, I had the benefit of being a single, young, stupid male, which is very much the target demographic for
Yeah.
jiu-jitsu. I had nothing to lose, and I was stubborn, and I'd made the decision that I was going to start training right then and there. And in retrospect, people talk about how the attrition rate in jiu-jitsu is so high and so many people drop off. I mean, and I know why that is. It's not because jiu-jitsu is made for lions among men. It's because most jiu-jitsu gyms are hostile at best and dangerous at worst, right? And I just decided to stick through it. Now, if I started jiu-jitsu today, knowing what I know now, I would probably, being a dad, being much more injury averse, being over 40, I would probably think twice about just rolling into a martial arts club unless I was really sure it was safe. But back then, I knew nothing. I had no context I never thought about what would be the risk of a long-term injury. I didn't know what was normal in a gym and what wasn't. So I kind of just trusted the instructor to throw everything he had at me and see what stuck. But you're right. Back then, jiu-jitsu was just starting to evolve out of the what the hell is this phase of the martial arts journey to the phase where people kind of had a cursory idea, but it was still very much developing. I remember in 2008, my instructor coming in one day and being like, there's this guy called Marcelo Garcia. He's got this revolutionary new guard they call the X guard. Everyone has to learn it now. And I also remember him coming in and saying things like, half guard is legitimate now. We actually need to learn this now. It's not just a pit stop on the way to passing someone. It's like there's things you can do from there, which probably sounds just preposterous to people who are training now. But I've seen that kind of quantum leap several times in the journey. I mean, I guess the other big quantum leaps that I would bring up are obviously the introduction of the modern leg lock game. I would say the introduction of systems thinking to the sport. People bringing in more science to the sport is also relatively new. And I think the rise of things like ADCC and CJI have also led people to realize that, hey, wait a minute, wrestling is actually important, which I just find hilarious that we discovered wrestling in jiu-jitsu after all of these years. So for me at the time, I didn't really have any context to know what was weird or what wasn't. I didn't really, like a child, I didn't understand how far along the sport was in its development. But in the hindsight of now, it was probably a good time to start. Jiu-jitsu was still relatively new. I would prefer to have started in 2024, where the sport has evolved much more. And I would say there's also much more awareness of the things that can go wrong when you train jiu-jitsu. But all in all, a good journey. I can't complain.
Yeah. It's interesting hearing you reflect on the evolution. It calls to mind a certain comparison to my experience cutting my teeth in the news industry. It was like, so I worked for like the biggest newspaper in the state of New Jersey, and it was very much a newspaper. It was not a digital media organization. And it was like they woke up one day in 2009 and discovered the internet. Like, oh, there's this internet thing. Like, we better pay attention to it. And I feel like jujitsu as an entity and to a certain extent as a business too is having that similar waking up and discovering the internet moment. And it's not necessarily the internet itself, but what I mean by that is there are these revelations of like, oh, maybe the traditional hierarchical way we teach is not the best way to do it. Eco seems really cool. Well, like that's been studied and researched and developed like since the 19th century, I think, maybe even earlier. But it's like jiu-jitsu has discovered eco and invented it.
Yeah.
Or there are any other number of comparisons. But yeah, I do feel like we're in this weird coming of age moment that's sort of lagging. We're certainly lagging other sports, but also lagging other constructs too. I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes any sense to you.
It absolutely does. I think with jiu-jitsu itself is in its infancy still, a sport that is maybe just over 100 years if you give it credit, right? I mean, you can make the argument that it's just a deviation of judo and Japanese jiu-jitsu and all of that. So technically grappling has been around since time immemorial, but jiu-jitsu as we know it today is still very new. And so it's understandable that we're kind of lagging a lot of the best practices that we see in other sports. I think there are also things within the jiu-jitsu culture that maybe make it a little bit harder to integrate new and exciting ideas. It is a sport that ultimately is ruggedly individual. It attracts a certain type of person that probably doesn't like listening to other people. And on top of that, although we like to think of jiu-jitsu as being non-traditional, it still does have a lot in common with the traditional martial arts in terms of hierarchy and respect and lineage and caring about the black belt and all of these things. I mean, I would say in many ways, the black belt is more venerated in jiu-jitsu than it is in a lot of other martial arts, right? And so it can be hard sometimes to integrate new ideas because people, they do, whether they will agree to it or not, they do have this element of traditionalism to their teaching. And cracking through that has been pretty hard, especially when in the world of jiu-jitsu, we don't really have that much competition to test the stuff out. I mean, it's only relatively recently that lots of high profile jiu-jitsu competition has really been a major concern. And so it's been easy, I think, for a lot of coaches to just kind of fly under the radar and do what they've always been doing and not really have any feedback that shows them their method is wrong. So I think just now we're starting to see people really question their methods and start to bring into, like you said, some of the things that other disciplines like the invasion sports have been doing for decades already. We're just picking up on now. But hey, better late than never, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's driving the evolution of the sport in a positive direction. So it's kind of hard to argue with that. But I feel like BJJ Mental Models and other information products out there in the BJJ landscape right now have a very important role to play, and that's something I kind of wanted to talk about with you thematically a bit here. Is that it seems to me, and this is a pattern I noticed too, in the drawing from my experience in the news industry. The internet flooded the zone in terms of democratizing content production and democratizing the dissemination of information. And I kind of saw what havoc that has wreaked on the truth-seeking process writ large in Western society. And you can kind of draw some analogs to jiu-jitsu too. Jiu-jitsu is lagging, like I said earlier, in this information evolution. I saw this most prominently, I want to say, like around when I first started training jiu-jitsu and Instagram culture was starting to become more and more of a thing. And you would see this proliferation of content that looked amazing, but the efficacy of the techniques was dubious at best. The intentions of the content producers was unclear or dubious at best. So it seems to me BJJ Mental Models has always felt like a breath of fresh air and clear-headedness in this otherwise chaotic sort of information landscape. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that. Like, what are you guys doing? How do you see things? How do you frame things in such a way where you can be a part of the evolution of the game and driving that forward, elevating the standards, but at the same time, like, maintain a clear head about it all?
Well, I guess the place to start is by asking the question and then answering it. What is a mental model anyway? It's terminology that you will hear in other fields. I first encountered it in finance and business. But basically, a mental model is just a mental shortcut, right? It's like a brain hack. So you see a pattern, you see something, you observe it, and then you realize I can probably generalize that idea. And then a week later, when you see that pattern again, you can think to yourself, oh, it's one of those things again. I've seen that before. I know how to deal with this. Last time I did this and it worked, and this other thing didn't work, so I know what to do. And the goal is you come up with quick decisions, fast, right? You want to make fast, high quality decisions. This is tremendously important in any complex endeavor. So in business, this becomes very critical. It's about how we make decisions internally. And in jiu-jitsu, it's especially critical because in a roll, you have a microsecond sometimes to respond. You better make the right decision. And the challenge that I found with jiu-jitsu is that there was when I started, and I would say there very much still is, a rush to make jiu-jitsu as complicated as possible. And I understand that, right? Because sometimes just throwing more ideas out there, it feels like more is better, more information is better. So everyone's got their ideas just out there and trying to add as many little details and variations as possible. And the end result is you turn jiu-jitsu into something that is incredibly big and complicated. Now, if anyone has a background in communications or infocomms or anything like that, they will understand that the secret to communication is not to make things more complicated, it's to streamline and simplify. And that's ultimately what a mental model is, right? A mental model is not necessarily a scientific thing, right? And that's why I specifically chose that language. I try to avoid saying things like laws or principles or rules, because that implies that things are more complicated and absolute than they are. We're just looking for quick ideas that we can use to make quick decisions off of. It doesn't have to always be true. This is more casual, which is what I like about that terminology. And it allows us to keep things a bit simpler. I think that if anything, the rush to make jiu-jitsu more complicated is getting even worse. But as the saying goes, it's a lot easier to make things complicated than it is to make things simple. Making things complicated is easy. Making things simple is tremendously hard. And so I spent a lot of time kind of using simplification practices to try to distill down what jiu-jitsu really meant to me and try to turn it into simple, snappy ideas, right? I don't want to use unnecessarily complicated language. I don't want to throw in Japanese terms that people might not understand, right? My goal is I want everyone to be able to understand something quickly. And I think the reason why that's resonated with so many people is because 99% of us are on a time and resource budget when it comes to how we train. And too much of the content out there is made from the perspective of the people making the content. I mean, if you are a full-time jiu-jitsu athlete and you train 6 hours a day and you've been training for 15 years, you can afford to go and dig into the weird esoteric details and just throw as much stuff out there because you're assuming that your audience, they're people who are like you, super, they've got this massive dearth of knowledge. And also they're people who are willing to spend endless hours researching and studying jiu-jitsu. The vast majority of people who will do the sport never do that, right? Asking someone to sit down and watch an 8-hour John Danaher instructional and drop $500 on it is a big ask. And you might do that if you are like a pro competitor looking for anything that they could do to get an edge. But for most people, it's about intelligent time management. If you are training 2 times a week, right, or less, how can you get good at this? And I think that's where things like systems thinking and mental models become even more important. I know that professionals use them a lot to make good decisions quicker, but it's also great for hobbyists and casual people because if you've only got 2 hours on the mat every week to train, you got to really make that count. Right? If you're training 6 hours a day, you're going to get good no matter what. It's just a matter of how good. But if you are a casual person, you need to really make sure that you're not wasting your time. And so I think the big thing that makes us stand out is we're not trying to flood the zone, as you said, right? We're trying to distill and simplify things. We're trying to make sure that, like, my goal is if someone comes to BJJ Mental Models and they listen to one episode or read one article or consume one course, I want them to quickly take something away that they can use to get better at jiu-jitsu. And I want it to be so dumb and simple that you don't really have to think. It should, if it's communicated properly, it should be pretty obvious when you hear it. Like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense, right? And then it's just something that you can use as a decision-making tool in the future. That's kind of the way that we attack things. And I think that's very different from the approach many other people take, which is where we've got to have more. We've got to have more details. The one thing that the eco guys say a lot, which I totally agree with, is techniques and details don't work, right? I mean, you can't just memorize every little detail of jiu-jitsu unless you're like a Mikey Musumeci level savant. Most people have brain power limitations in the sport. And so it makes sense to try to kill our thinking, to think less when we're rolling rather than trying to make us think more when we're rolling.
Yeah, that's certainly been true for me experientially. And let me say, before I say what I'm about to say, I agree with you. Otherwise, I wouldn't do a show on BJJ Mental Models with Emily Kwok. But to play devil's advocate and to also be somewhat hypocritical, because I'm going to use a mental model of my own here. if I were to challenge you on that, I would say something to the effect of, well, Steve, the map is not the territory. Like if we oversimplify things, we don't get a high enough resolution view of the sport, and we miss out on essential details, et cetera, et cetera. Is your perspective like this is more of like use another mental model, Jesus. This is more of like an 80-20 thing? Like you're distilling things down to the 20% that gives the 80% of the results if by kind of chunking things down to mental models? Like what is your sort of rebuttal to that argument?
Yeah, so I would say that the details absolutely do matter, but they tend to emerge at a different time, and you tend to need to feed people information at the level that they're at and that they're ready for. A very common mistake that black belt instructors make is they overteach something, right? If I sit down a 1 month white belt and I show them everything I know about an arm bar, I am going to overload their cognitive capabilities so bad that they will remember nothing. But if I can give them one or two little details that really kind of help them understand what we're doing here, what the eco guys would call, I guess, the invariants, then that at least sticks with them. Yes, I am absolutely missing more details, but that's by design. It's because, first of all, they weren't at the level yet where they were ready to absorb those details. And second of all, a lot of those details are often best discovered either organically or on demand, right? So if there's a little detail you need, like, let me give you an example. Something that I like to do if I'm trying to armbar you from top position, right, and I just don't have it, right? People sometimes they try to pull the arm back, or they've got all sorts of clever little tricks about how to like manipulate the wrist to break the person's grip. What I actually like to do is I like to scooch back closer to the person. I like to close off the space around their shoulders and maybe even come back to a mounted position. And I do think this is a very effective way to deal with someone who is stubbornly refusing to be armbarred when they're on bottom side control or bottom mount. But I wouldn't waste my time just teaching that to people on day one. I would wait until the need arises. Eventually, some student is going to come to me and say, I can't finish this damn armbar. I'm doing everything right, but this jackass is holding his hands together like this, and I can't break the grip. And every time I do a grip break, it creates space and he escapes, right? There's a time for a lesson to be fed to people. And understanding the timing of when to teach is something that I have not heard any other teacher in jiu-jitsu talk about, right? It's not about just spewing all of your knowledge at the student. It's about knowing when they're ready for the next lesson and giving that to them. I agree completely with everything you said. I mean, the map is not the territory is a phrase that we use very often on BJJ Mental Models. And the first thing I always encourage people to understand is a lot of the stuff that I talk about, that is either stuff from my perspective or from the perspective of people who have inspired me, and I'm regurgitating it. But that doesn't mean it's the one true way to do things. I mean, the way that, let me give you an example. We talk a lot about Rob Bernanke's alignment framework in jiu-jitsu. It's a great way to understand jiu-jitsu from the ground up. It's not the only way, right? There's a million other ways. And some people will hear someone else say something like maybe they like Danaher's language better. That's fine, right? Those are all just different mental models. What we try to do when we create content is make sure that those mental models are not interdependent. You brought about my background in technology, right? One of the most important things when you're building a complicated system, a software system, is you don't want all of the bits and pieces to be too tightly coupled together. If your code is all like, they call it spaghetti code, right? If it's all like intertwined where you can't pull it apart, then every time you make a change to something, the whole system just falls apart like a house of cards. And learning to write code that is decoupled very much inspired the way that I communicate. I try to make conversations that are decoupled. If you jump into any episode of BJJ Mental Models, I want to make sure that if you have no assumed knowledge about this product or even jiu-jitsu, you'll still hit the one or two main lessons that I want. And then I may provide references at another point to kind of next level things. But I always try to make sure that everything that we say stands alone. I don't want someone to come in and feel like they just jumped into the second season of 24 and they have no idea what the hell's going on. Right? I guess that's a good example, right? I mean, if you watch like The Tonight Show, you can jump into any episode and you'll be able to follow it. If you jump into like the fourth season of Lost, you will have no idea what's going on. I don't want to be like that. I want to make sure that everything is discrete and it stands on its own. And mental models are a great way to think about that, has been my advice. You're right that there may be time when a mental model might require more detail, and we often document those, but we will just teach or provide them at a different time.
Yeah. What you're saying about comprehensiveness and timing is really resonating with me right now. This is something that I think is a crossover skill from my time in journalism, because as a journalist, you're constantly thinking in the inverted pyramid. You're building what's the essential point, and then how do we substantiate it further and further and further for those who want more detail. And I say this as somebody who's still kind of a novice instructor. I've only been teaching jiu-jitsu now for like 3 or 4 years, and have a lot of I have a lot of a way to go in terms of developing myself as an instructor. But uh, I do see the tendency of a lot of instructors, not just black belts. I often see this in brown belts and purple belts who are trying to kind of prove themselves. I see this tendency to shotgun blast people or like fire hose blast people with information. And there really is this disconnect between what is good enough or comprehensive enough right now for this person. How do I meet them where they're at versus how do I show how much I know? That's a real point of attention for a lot of instructors. And I'm wondering, you seem to have like a pretty good grasp on this. Like, how do you overcome that as an instructor, or how do you become more aware of that tendency as an instructor?
The language that I use to describe this is incremental learning. I like to try to break lessons up into, here's the base core stuff that everyone needs to understand. If we are to distill an aspect of jiu-jitsu down to very first principles, what are those first principles? And again, I don't know if there is a right answer. We may all have different opinions on what the most important things of jiu-jitsu are. And I would never claim that I know the right answer. In fact, I'm probably the last person to make such a claim. So that's why we always try to have other people on to present their variants. You may have many people who look at things through a very different lens, and I don't always know what that best lens is going to be. So I put a lot of ideas out there. But I would say my general advice is understand that try to think of what the person is going to ask for next, right? Think of like the Socratic method, right? You're trying to help people build up their own knowledge. You cannot just go full Matrix Neo and just upload your brain into the other person and just teach them jujitsu just by talking to them about it, right? That's really the fundamental lesson of the ecological approach, is that that doesn't work, right? We know that doesn't work. You have to do jujitsu yourself. We can guide you, but ultimately the learning comes from within. And so a good teacher, in my opinion, is someone who understands that the learning is not about me, the teacher, it's about you, the student. And I try to figure out what is the next step forward that you need to take, and how can I cook the books so that you take that step forward properly. So a good example, I mean, if you want to get specific here, would be if I am trying to teach someone how to pass the guard, I think that the classical approach, which is every week I show you a different guard pass, is not the optimal way. I mean, it'll work, right? Over time, it'll work, but it's not the most efficient. And the reality is most of your students are going to forget 90+% of what you teach, or they'll never use it. So I would prefer to figure out, okay, well, what do I really want to do when I'm entering someone's guard? Like, how does that look? What actually is the guard at the end of the day? A way that Rob describes this, Rob Bernanke, is he talks about these 3 phases of guard. There's like the engagement phase, where you're both kind of jockeying to win the grip fight and to get into a guard, but it's before the guard is actually established. Then there is the maintenance phase, which is where you are basically in a defined guard. And it all comes down to who kind of gets the upper hand from there. And then finally, there is the retention phase, which is someone is in the process of passing. Maybe I cleared your legs, I'm getting past your hip line, and you've got 3 seconds to get your guard back before it's established as side control, right? So I would start with that just so people understand. Then you can bake a game around that, right? You can make a game around grip fighting. Really, when I enter someone's guard, I don't really care what pass they do or what pass I attempt. I just want to make sure I win the grip fight first. So I would focus on that and say, like, don't even worry about passing. Just try to get into the person's guard where you've got the controlling grips and they don't. And then from there, you can start to add more layers of detail on, and you can start to say, oh, okay, well, make sure they never get access to your knees and your elbows, right? Because if they can control your knees or your elbows, that's usually when bad things start to happen in the guard, right? If I can get into your guard, but I can make sure you cannot control my knees and elbows, you can't really fully control my limbs, and that means I'm probably safe. And if you teach that way with kind of increasing levels of specificity, eventually you're going to get to the point where you can say, okay, you understand the basics. Here's one thing you could do. It's called a Toriando pass, right? And people should be able to immediately understand at that point what that is, because it ties into all of the principles they already talked about. If you just go right into the Toriando pass without setting the foundational concepts, then what winds up happening is people are so focused on following the steps that they don't understand why they're following the steps. And they almost, another term from software, they do what's called like cargo culting, which is where you're following the instructions, but you don't understand the purpose of the instructions, but you're just doing them because that's how it was always done. And that's what you were told to do. And often that results in worse jiu-jitsu. So that's kind of my thought, right? The granularity matters. Eventually we do get to the techniques and the details, but the need for those emerges organically once the fundamental concepts are in place. And really a technique is just an example of concepts in action, right? All a Toriando pass is, or a leg drag pass is an example, a variant of all of the concepts that I just talked about being applied. And if you know the concepts, you don't really need the techniques. The techniques will be things that you can bolt on afterwards. Someone that you know very well, Josh Waitskin, would call this making smaller circles, right? Compressing down on the details and then building on top of that. At least I hope that's what he would say. Josh, if you're listening to this and I misrepresented you, I'm so sorry, but that's how I have interpreted your gospel.
So I wanted to kind of pivot in more of a high level direction here in terms of looking at BJJ mental models from a distance. It's pretty cool to see, in my opinion, how it's evolved from being sort of this community to being a driving force in the sport as a whole. And, it's right now you have various shows there where you pay your content contributors to do their thing. I saw you just added Andrea the other day, which is really cool. You're sponsoring athletes. So you tell me about like, what does it mean to you now to be in a place where you can do these things? And how do you see that shaping the sport as we go forward?
Right now, that honestly, in terms of jiu-jitsu, that's the only thing I care about now. If for some reason I was never able to roll again, I could be at peace with that. But if I lost the ability to kind of help the community, I would not be okay with that. That's the most important thing to me at the moment. Yeah, we started BJJ Mental Models because, again, I noticed at some point that thinking in terms of these concepts, like forgetting what my instructor was telling me and just really simplifying my thinking down to like one-liner, snappy ideas was really evolutionary in my jiu-jitsu. To the point where when I started doing that, people noticed and they were like, "What, Steve, why did you get so much better so quick? Or were you studying Danaher or something?" It's like, I've never watched a Danaher instructional in my life. But interestingly, my brother has a very different approach to me. He is a professional jiu-jitsu athlete. He runs a gym. He is that guy who trains 6 hours a day or whatever, right? He's the #1 ranked grappler in British Columbia at the moment. He trains under Rob Bernacki. And what I found interesting was you've got me, this hobbyist black belt, and my brother, a pro black belt, and we both generally agreed on the importance of concepts and came to those conclusions almost independently, right? Because Rob Bernacki is best known for BJJ concepts and his work there. And at the time, I wasn't really familiar with Rob, and I was fascinated that there were other people doing this too. So that's kind of how we started BJJ Mental Models. At the beginning, the idea was, let's just make like a wiki of concepts. And that's what we did. And then we got to thinking, you know what, it would be kind of fun to talk about this stuff. So we did a podcast. So that's what we did. And then from there, we just kind of expanded and expanded. And when the pandemic happened, we started off with a Patreon. And that was a really pivotal moment for me because I didn't think anyone was going to pay for this stuff, right? And we started asking people for money with no promise of anything back. And I was really surprised at how many people were willing to support us. And I thought, man, you know what? I think there's a business model here. So since then, BJJ Mental Models has grown from like a website and a podcast to an entire platform. And if I'm being pretentious here, I would like it to be a movement in some ways, a movement to simplify jiu-jitsu and emphasize the good things about jiu-jitsu, the inclusivity, the ability to transform people's lives and to steer people away from the bad things, right? The toxic aspects of cult behavior in gyms, the overly macho stuff that I think in a lot of ways is detrimental and drives people away from the sport. People say jiu-jitsu is for everyone. I don't know if that's really true or not, but I will say that a lot of the way that instructors present jiu-jitsu does not make it for everyone. And I want jiu-jitsu to be something that at least everyone is willing to try. So we now have the opportunity because we've got to the point where we've got enough subscribers to our premium service that we don't run advertisements. All of our money comes from our premium subscribers that we can return money back to the athletes. So one of the coolest things for me was This year, if you were watching ADCC or CJI, you probably saw our logo plastered on a lot of people's butts. We sponsored Joseph Chen, Margot Ciccarelli, Chris Wojcik, Liz Mitrovic, Brianna St. Marie. That was a huge thing for me. Just the fact that we were able to help people at that level, and the fact that they were willing to wear our logo. Because like, who am I really? I've never competed. I'm just a hobbyist black belt who just really likes jiu-jitsu. And to have athletes of that level be like, we believe in this, to the point where we're willing to wear it on our clothes and advertise it on our social, is like, I can't really say how meaningful that is. I can't put it into words. And to date, I guess I can say this, we've invested both in terms of direct and indirect sponsorships and revenue opportunities to athletes. We're about to, I'm probably within about a month, we'll be able to say we've invested $50,000 so far back into athletes, which is something I never thought we'd have the possibility to do, the option to do. And that allows me to help give opportunities to and to promote athletes who I really think represent the best that the sport has to offer, not just in terms of they go out there and they win all the time, but in terms of they're the kind of moral character and they represent the way of thinking about jiu-jitsu that I think moves the sport forward.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something I've always loved about the brand in general, is that you guys are very strategic and consistent about the kind of people you platform and give a spotlight to. And it seems like you're very methodical in selecting people who are overall positive influences on the sport, both from a moral perspective and from a practical application perspective too. And that's just fantastic to see.
Yeah. The thing I have found is the name value of the guest is almost meaningless, right? You can get a massive name guest on your podcast. You might get a minor bump in listenership, but I found it actually doesn't make that much of a difference. What's more important is the specific guest, the community they represent, and the topic that they want to present. That combination is magic sometimes, and it's not always the people that you would think. Like one of our most popular episodes, we had a blue or purple belt who is a board certified dermatologist come in and just give like a whole treatise on skincare and jiu-jitsu.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Clayton Green. He was on my
Clayton
show
Green.
too.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And that was one of our more popular.
He got promoted.
Congrats, Clayton. Yeah, that's why I brought it up. I think he mentioned that he got promoted. But that kind of content is not discussed much in jiu-jitsu, and it affects everyone. Like, who doesn't worry about skin issues in jiu-jitsu? Yeah, we all do.
If you don't, you should.
Yeah, but you're certainly not going to find a 10-hour John Danaher instructional about skincare in jiu-jitsu, right? And that's always been my focus, is bringing attention to people who, like yourself actually, who offer, I think, tremendous value to the community, but they don't get like the Craig Jones Instagram boost, right? I think there is massive value to be had there. And some of my favorite episodes are with people who just, they don't come in with any celebrity, but they just have a great, unique way of thinking about jiu-jitsu that adds value to the people around them.
Yeah, those are the people that I've always targeted in terms of the rare occasions when I bring a guest on this podcast. Most of my guests are not even, I don't think I've brought anyone on my podcast who's above a blue belt, to be honest with you. Rank really has nothing to do with it. It's about the quality of your ideas and the quality of your character. And that's why I feel like I'm staunchly and squarely in the corner of BJJ Mental Models and all things here.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks. Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think that the thing people don't realize, we get so focused on the black belt, but look, first of all, getting a black belt is not as hard as people will tell you, right? It's more of a battle of time.
Yeah, just keep showing up.
Yeah. And I've said this before. I know everyone's like, no, my instructor has standards. He would never promote somebody. I'm sorry. I've heard a lot of black belts claim that they've got these ridiculous lofty standards. I have never met a black belt who will deny one of their students a black belt if they've been training long enough. I've never seen a black belt actually sit down and be like, look, Joe, I know that you've been training for 15 years, but I just think you're terrible and irredeemable at jiu-jitsu, and I will never give you a black belt. That does not happen. A black belt is not a board certified rank. It is not, there is no barrier to entry. There is no objective criteria. If you want to really impress me, show me that you've defended a PhD on theoretical physics, right, against your peers. And that is a much more impressive credential because there's a bar that you have to clear.
Right.
And so I think in jiu-jitsu, we care way too much about the importance of the black belt. That might mean you're good at doing arm bars, but it doesn't mean you're good at teaching arm bars. It doesn't mean you're good at getting the best out of your athletes and your students. And if you've got people in your room who have masters in education and you're not listening to them or taking advantage of that because they're a white belt and you're a black belt, you're kind of a bit of a dumbass, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is something that Crete Nicholson mentioned, as he realized one day that like he's got all of these white belts in his room and they're all like doctors and engineers and master educators. And here he's just some like dumbass who likes to play turtle. And why not use that? Why not use those lessons and bring them in? And I think in jiu-jitsu, that belt is such a powerful visual that people put way too much importance on it, and not nearly enough importance on the other area, the real areas of expertise that people bring into the classroom from their day lives.
Yeah. Or just simple character, right? Like
Yep.
there are any number of black belts out there who I wouldn't trust to watch my son. And they're running schools.
I can imagine who those might be. Yeah, I mean, this to me, I had a big crisis of confidence when I was a blue belt because I mentioned this earlier. I chose my first gem based just entirely on Google SEO. I just went to like Google and I typed in jiu-jitsu in my town and took the first result. And I didn't know of how to assess a good gym. It didn't even occur to me to do so. I didn't realize I was going to create this weird symbiotic relationship with my coach over the years. I didn't know enough about jiu-jitsu to know what that meant. And I certainly didn't know how much gross toxicity lives under the surface in the jiu-jitsu space. I had no idea. Hopefully people now coming into the sport have a better idea, but I, as a new person to martial arts, didn't know. And I mean, let's not pick on jiu-jitsu. This is a tale as old as time. Martial arts instructors have always abused their power to do awful things to their students. Jiu-jitsu is not unique in that regard, but I didn't know any of this. Then when I got to blue belt, I wasn't just a white belt in the room anymore, right? Just the guy who the teacher doesn't even know the name of. Suddenly people started telling me things and I started to learn about all of the backstage drama at the gym that goes on. And I realized like, I was really shocked because I come from a professional office environment and like the kinds of things that would get you fired in an instant in a day job were just kind of like a fact of life in a lot of jiu-jitsu gyms. And I went through a period where I had to decide, do I want to leave? I'm just not morally aligned with what's happening in this gym. And that ultimately, at the end of the day, I wound up having to leave. And I'm very glad that I did. And part of what I try to do is make people understand there is much more to jiu-jitsu than just the techniques and the mechanics, right? If you go to BJJ Mental Models and check out our database of concepts, we break them down broadly into 4 categories. We talk about mechanical concepts, like how the body actually works, but we also talk about strategic concepts, how you make decisions. We talk about learning concepts, how you enhance your own skills. And we also talk about social concepts, how you interact with the team around you and how you bring out the best in the people around you. And under that organization, the mechanics of jiu-jitsu, that's just one tiny piece of this much bigger puzzle. Every jiu-jitsu instructor I know is so focused on the mechanics of jiu-jitsu that they're neglecting the importance of the other things. And if your jiu-jitsu gym, if you're a gym owner and you don't have a defined process or methodology for managing the culture at your gym, that to me is, I mean, I wouldn't say this before, but maybe now I would say, I think that's almost a red flag, because if you don't define the culture of your gym explicitly, the people in the gym will define it for you, or they will interpret it based on your behavior. And it will probably not be the interpretation you wanted.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think this is something too that just comes from having worked in the corporate world in different environments. You see that dynamic at play when you work at different companies. You see companies where the culture is completely disjointed and it's dysfunctional and toxic. You see companies where it's more sort of curated and open and it's not toxic. And this is something that sort of jiu-jitsu is waking up to as it matures as an industry, that this is indeed something that needs to be paid attention to, and not just, and I want to underscore this point I'm making, it's not just for business reasons. To me, that's secondary. It's the moral and ethical thing to do, is to set that standard and maintain it. And, I think that's something we all need to think carefully about and act on in our schools.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that ultimately the moral compass should be the reason why these decisions are made. But I mean, honestly, if I were to make this case to a completely self-absorbed jerk, I would say you still want to rigorously define and protect your culture because you like money, right? I mean, don't you want people to come train with you? Are you proud of the fact that 90% of your white belts quit within their first year? That's not something you should brag about, right? I know that in jiu-jitsu, we often condition ourselves to look at that like it's a good thing. Like, we're the survivors, 90% of people would quit, but we're the tough ones who stuck it out. That's not what happened, buddy, right? What happened was 90% of your customers were driven off for one reason or another. Maybe your environment wasn't safe and they got injured. Maybe they hated the people in your gym because they were saying incredibly crude, awful stuff. Maybe they just were not impressed by the professionalism or the cleanliness of the environment. Maybe your coaching was garbage. There's a lot of reasons why white belts leave jiu-jitsu within their first year, and it is usually not that they were weak and you were strong, right? It is usually that you as a business person failed them somehow. And trying to sugarcoat that to protect your own ego and make it think like, well, they just weren't tough enough, it's bad for business.
Yeah. So since we're on the subject of shit talking jiu-jitsu as a whole, this is the magic wand question. If you could just wave a magic wand and like fix any one thing about jiu-jitsu, what would it be?
Oh boy. I know what it is. Like, I know how to explain what I see that I don't like, but I don't know what the solution is. So let's start from there. Maybe we can reverse engineer this and work backward. The thing that I wish was that I think in a lot of ways, the modern jiu-jitsu culture brings out a lot of the worst in people, right? The amount of just toxicity and hostility that I see, especially online, I don't think it represents the best of the sport, right? I mean, the highest level athletes in our sport often behave like total children. They would get fired from any other job on day one. They would get removed from any other sport on day one, not just for ethical codes, but also because they couldn't pass a PED test, right? To me, something that Don Whitefield said, the guy who gave me my black belt, was his goal is to get you into this journey and through this journey to purple belt, ideally to black belt, without any like major life-altering injuries. His goal is to make sure that you experience the life-improving benefits of jiu-jitsu, and that's kind of the lens that you see this from. That's what I would like to see. I don't want people going in and training in these brutish fight clubs where they suffer catastrophic injuries at white belt and blue belt where it doesn't even matter. I don't want to hear about my friends getting driven out of their gyms because of some local drama bullshit. I don't want to hear about the women in my life getting sexually harassed because they went to jiu-jitsu because they wanted to learn to protect themselves from that bullshit in the first place. All of that kind of toxic, childish nature of jiu-jitsu, that hostile nature, I would love to see gone. How do you make it go away? I don't know.
Yeah.
If I knew that, man, I would do a whole episode on it and get up on a pulpit and talk
Maybe
about it. I know.
Whole series.
Yeah. And I am not going to say, of course, that jiu-jitsu is unique in this. I mean, as long as there are human beings, that toxicity will always exist. But I think a big part of everyone's job is to try to push that back, right? Push back that floodgates. There is that base terrible element of human nature that lives within all of us. And I think that we as a community have the obligation to push back on that, especially once you get up to black belt and people respect you and have you have a name and they look to you for inspiration and motivation and instruction. You have an obligation to push back on the bad parts of the sport, to shed light on them, to protect people from them. And that I would love to see done more. Maybe that's it. I wish that people would push back on the bad elements of the sport more and drive them out to the fringes. I don't want a world where we have to be legitimately, I think it was Mikey who just said the other day, he believes there's like 13 and 14-year-olds who are getting juiced up on PEDs. I can't prove it, but I believe it, right? I absolutely believe that is happening. And look, I am enough of a professional wrestling fan to know what happens if you allow athletes to use steroids to an unregulated level, right? I don't want to see these people dropping dead of heart attacks at 20 or 30. That's not the sport that I fell in love with.
Yeah. And I'll add to this too, Steve. I don't want to put this on lower belts or new students or whatever and say it's like your obligation or responsibility or anything like that. But you should feel empowered to see this shit and say it and call it the shit that it is. Like, just because I say this all the time on my podcast, I'm just a guy who went to Guitar Center and bought a microphone. You could do this too. I'm just a guy who kept showing up long enough and got a black belt. That has nothing to do with my moral character. That has nothing to do with my values. That has nothing to do with my ethics. I'm just a guy who kept showing up and got the belt. The respect and the authority that you give to school owners is exactly that. Like, it's given to them, and you don't necessarily have to give it to them just because they had enough money to open up a school and they had enough credit and capital to sign a lease. That's really all this comes down to. Anyone running a school in any country in the world, they're just as mortal as any of us, and they're just as prone to these moral failures and these ethical failures. So if you're out there and you're brand new to the sport, like, I don't want to put it on you and say like it's your job to enforce this stuff, but you should feel empowered to call it what it is and point it out when you see it.
Yeah. This is not a completely an apples to apples comparison, but something that I always tell people, and people who've listened to my podcast have probably heard me say this a million times, so I apologize for being redundant, but I always encourage people when they see something unusual at their gym and they're not sure if it's like quote unquote normal or okay. I always encourage them to ask, if you were at a Starbucks, like, would you accept this kind of behavior? At any other business, would you accept this kind of behavior? And I acknowledge that jiu-jitsu is different, right? The relationship that you as a jiu-jitsu student develop with the people around you and with your coach, it's very different than a more transactional business. I get that. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, this still is a business. You are paying someone else to deliver some value to you. If you would not tolerate the behavior you're seeing from another business that you interact with, walk away, right? I mean, and I know that's easier said than done, right? There's definitely advice we've given on how to detach from a toxic gym, but walk away. I mean, would you go into Starbucks and if they try to whip you with their aprons, would you allow that? If they tried to kick you out of the Starbucks because they saw you going to a different coffee shop, would you think that's okay? If the barista started mercilessly hitting on you and trying to sleep with you, would you think that's okay, right? None of these things would be okay. But in jiu-jitsu, for some reason, it gets a pass, or it doesn't get treated the same way that we would treat behavior at any other business. I was talking to Elliot Marshall a while ago, and he talked about how at his affiliation, they have an HR department. And I was thinking, man, that's a trip, right? I've never seen another jiu-jitsu gym that has an HR department. And probably that makes sense because most of the shit that instructors do would get them fired on day one in any other job that actually had an HR department. We're still very immature in the sport in terms of where we stand ethically. And so I find that a very helpful thing to consider is if you see something weird at your gym, imagine it's not a jiu-jitsu gym. Imagine it's a coffee shop or a pizza shop. Would you allow this kind of behavior? If not, that probably means something is wrong and you need to leave.
Great mental model, Steve.
Thank you, sir.
A couple more questions for you. We might only have time for one. I do want to ask you about this injury because jiu-jitsu is a huge part of your life, and you've been in this situation now for a number of months where you can't train and you can only engage with it intellectually. How's that been for you? And I'm asking specifically because if you're fortunate to go through your entire jiu-jitsu career without an injury like this, good for you. But my sense is that we're all kind of due. We all are going to get at least one at one point or another. And it's anytime I've been hurt with any seriousness, it's been more than just a physical hurt. It's been like a mental and emotional hurt. So I just want to get any insights from you as to how to navigate that successfully, if you can navigate it successfully at all.
Sure. So for me, this is my first big injury, but it is not my first big layoff by any stretch. This is a common thing, right? I remember when I was a more junior belt, the idea of taking like a week or a month or even longer off of jiu-jitsu was just like devastating to me to just think about it. But once you train long enough, you realize that time off is inevitable. It happens, and you just make the most of it. My first big layoff was when my daughter was born. I took a year and a half off. That was before I got my black belt. The second big layoff was COVID. I took several years off, and then this is going to be my third big layoff. If this were my first big layoff, I would probably have a different opinion. But like anything, once you've been through it once or twice already, you realize, it's just I know what to do, right? Jiu-jitsu has been around for over 100 years. It will still be there when I get back. I am not a performance athlete. I am not in my prime. It does not matter. I don't have a window to go to ADCC and compete. That is not my interest. Jiu-jitsu for me is a lifestyle thing, so my priority is getting it fixed. And a big part of, and I got to admit, I struggle with this, right? It is depressing. It sucks. I'm not the kind of guy who loves every physical activity. I'm very picky about the kind of stuff that I want to do. So, and also with a shoulder injury, a lot of the things that you would want to do are just off the table. Like I have as far as I can tell, dual labrum tears in my shoulder. Weightlifting, which is another thing I like to do, kettlebells, totally off the menu. Can't do it. Even for a while, things like jogging, I couldn't do because of the pumping of the arm. It's gotten better now, to the point where I might even start reintroducing some very light jiu-jitsu, like technical drilling. But I remember I tried to do just some back defense, like just elbows in, block the choke while someone was on my back, nothing else. And even that re-triggered my shoulder. So I'm very limited in terms of what I can do, but I found some other stuff. I mean, I've got like water exercises I can do to get the heart rate up and to kind of keep the shoulder muscles strong. And talking to a lot of athletes, one of the things that I've always been impressed by is the way that they think about injuries. The first guest we ever had on BJJ Mental Models was Oliver Taza. And at the time he came on, he had a pretty bad knee injury. He was off for quite a while. And he was super cheerful about it. He's like, I'm going to use this time to travel around and do seminars and network and meet people like you, Steve, and blah, 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 blah. And I thought, you know what? That's a really cool attitude. Use that as an opportunity to do other things. And the cool thing about having a platform like BJJ Mental Models is I'm so integrated in the jiu-jitsu community and I'm always thinking about stuff. I don't really feel like I'm missing out, right? I mean, this is not the first call with you that I'm having today. It's not the only one I'm going to have about jiu-jitsu. I've got more calls lined up after this. Then I got to go and edit some conversations and respond to some messages. And I am still fully integrated into jiu-jitsu right now, even if my body is not doing it. So once you've been through that a few times, I guess my advice to anyone who is either suffering from any setback in jiu-jitsu, whether it be an injury or even just hitting a plateau, is that these are inevitable, they're normal, and they pass, right? And there's always ways that you can use that time off to work on something else. Beating yourself up over it and getting depressed and just doing nothing is not the way. Find something else that's productive that you can replace it with, right? And for me, with less time on the jiu-jitsu mats, I'm spending a lot more time having conversations like this with you, right? So maybe I can't train my body more, but I can help other people. And I also find conversations like this to be very educational for me as well. So for me, that's what I always suggest to people is just understand this is part of the game. Don't get depressed over it. Just find something else that can keep you active in the space, whatever it may be, whether it's studying instructionals, listening to podcasts, brainstorming. Try some private remote chin calls. A lot of very high performance athletes will do remote. Like if you want a good athlete, I just saw yesterday, Andrew Wiltsey does remote coaching now, and it's pretty reasonable. So if you've got an injury and you can't train, hop on a Zoom call with someone like him, right? That's a very good use of your time. You will get value out of it, even if you physically can't roll.
Yeah. That's great advice. So last question for you, Steve. I'm just going to seek some alpha here for you. What's next from BJJ Mental Models? What do you got on the horizon?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. So the big thing that I want to do is I don't want BJJ Mental Models to be like all about Steve. I want to make sure that there's a bigger team of people and they all get to contribute, right? There's a lot of people on our team that people may not know about. My editor, Carlos, is just absolutely amazing. We have a lot of people like Beatrice Jin, for example. She's one of our sponsored athletes, but she also helps out a lot on the back end. And then we've got a lot of ongoing podcasts that are frankly probably better than BJJ Mental Models. So for example, The Highest Levels, right, hosted by yourself and Emily Kwok, is available to our premium subscribers. Drew Foster, awesome black belt out of the States, affiliated with Brandon McCaffrin. He's got a show on our podcast called State of the Meta. And the idea is that it's a competition and meta-analysis podcast. So on BJJ Mental Models, we don't talk about that much. We talk more about timeless ideas. But if you want to know, like, what happened this month that you need to learn, he's the guy to break that down. I don't know anyone better. Like you mentioned, we just launched a news and culture podcast with Andrea Tang, another competitive jiu-jitsu athlete, probably best known for her work as a journalist at the Jiu-Jitsu Times. We've got some more podcasts on the go that are coming up soon that are going to be announced soon. We've got, of course, we have all of our audio courses that we always make and we continue to make. I've got some really exciting ones coming soon. I mean, I don't want to make too many promises because it's hard to schedule these things and I don't know when they're going to shake out. But we just launched a 6-part course on developing confidence. So it's not just me talking, but rather I am I provide the platform to the people who really know what they're speaking about. So if confidence is something you struggle with, we just put out what might be the most stacked jiu-jitsu instructional ever made. It features Rafael Lovato Jr., Joseph Chen, Elizabeth Clay, Sarah McMahon, Margaret Ciccarelli, and Dante Leone talking about confidence from all aspects. We're launching a mindset course with Cobrinha athlete Erin Hurley. She's also a mental performance coach. Some other stuff that we've got coming up. I'm just in the process of finalizing the details, but we've got more courses coming from Margaret Ciccarelli. We've got one underway with Dr. Kickass Mike Pekarsky about injury prevention and recovery. We've got one coming up with Joseph Chen, topic to be determined. We're probably going to do one with Adele Farnerino and her coach, Jaco Driscoll, topic undetermined. If anyone, by the way, has any suggestions on what we should talk to these people about and structure this around, let me know. But there's I feel like a lot of momentum on this. And I'm trying to step back a little bit and make sure that we spotlight the people in the community that really drive a lot add a lot of value into the jiu-jitsu space. So I would say that's the next thing, right? I want to take my name off of this and just be one of many talking heads, not be the guy who always has to do the talking. Frankly, because it's hard to talk all the time. I feel like an old person where I'm sure I'm just telling the same jokes over and over again. And it's nice to have other perspectives as well, right? It keeps things fresh and it keeps them interesting.
Totally. That's why I brought you on. I mean, I'm on episode number 81 and I'm like, how have I done 100 of these? I'm like closing in on 100 of these things. And I haven't run out of things to talk about yet, but I probably am repeating myself like a senile old man. But I guess it beats the alternative.
That's true. I'll tell you this, though. Something that Kabir Bath once told me. He's a black belt instructor, the head of Kaboom BJJ here in Vancouver. He's a black belt under Rafael Lovato Jr. and the head of Lovato's International Jiu-Jitsu Association. Something that he once told me was that you're going to get bored of your lessons well before your students do. And I think that applies to podcasting as well, right? When you teach an arm bar, you might think like I don't know if I want to spend 2 weeks on this. The students are going to get bored. No, they are not, right? They are going to struggle to learn as much as they possibly can. They're going to need to get hit with the lesson multiple times. They're going to forget things and need to be reminded. They're going to need to see different angles of things. You as the instructor, having the benefit of experience and the curse of knowledge, you are going to get bored of things much more quickly than your students will. And I'm sure that, you've got a pretty big back catalog of episodes now. I'm sure that you feel this too, right? We sometimes as communicators feel like we shouldn't repeat ourselves because, well, I've already said this 10 times on the podcast before, but we must also retain the perspective of the fact that a lot of the people who are listening, they may be listening to you for the first time. They don't have the benefit of that. For the people who have been listening since day one, they probably could use a reminder or reinforcement or a fresh perspective on the same idea. And moreover, the thing I am always acutely aware of is as a podcaster, like people are going to be listening to this while they're doing the dishes, while they're driving to work, while they're falling asleep, while they're on the toilet, right? I mean, it's not like they're sitting there in a classroom taking notes on everything I say, right? So I have to assume that sometimes they're just going to miss what I say and I have to repeat myself. And that has been a lesson from Kabir that was very valuable to me, is to understand that repetition is good. It's not a bad thing.
Noted, Steve. Noted. I always appreciate your insights and advice as I try to make BJJ Meditations more and more of a thing. I thank you very much for giving me a show with Emily on BJJ Mental Models, and I hope you'll always think of me and BJJ Meditations as sort of an ally in this fight to improve jiu-jitsu. And I thank you very much for your time for coming on the podcast today. I know there's any number of ways you could have spent the past hour, and I appreciate you for spending it with me.
You are most welcome, sir. I always love chatting with you. I agree that I think that BJJ Meditations is one of my favorite brands in the sport. Just the stuff that you represent and the slant that you take right from the name itself has always resonated with me, which is kind of what drew me to you in the first place and made me want to collaborate with you on the BJJ Mental Models Premium Podcast Network. So it's been a blast. I think that you're doing great stuff, man. And I think that your voice and your approach are fresh and very much needed.
Thank you, sir. Well, thanks for listening, folks. I hope you got some value out of this conversation with Steve. Steve, is there anything you want to anywhere you want to direct people who are listening to this podcast? Just send them to BJJ Mental Models Premium or anything else on your mind that you'd like to send them to?
Yeah, our plugs are pretty easy. I just tell people go to bjjmentalmodels.com. That's where everything we make lives. Our podcast is entirely free. Our newsletter is entirely free. Our database of concepts is entirely free. You suffer nothing by going there and at least checking it out. And it might be the missing piece that you were looking for to kind of upgrade your game. Beyond that, though, if you're looking for more from us, BJJ Mental Models Premium is how we float the boat. We do not run advertisements. Everything that we do is funded by our premium subscribers. If listening to this, you like what I'm saying and that resonates, and you also want more of Joe, I would definitely ask that everyone consider BJJ Mental Models Premium. It's a monthly subscription. You get access to what I think is the world's biggest and best library of audio classes for jiu-jitsu. If you want something different and you're tired of technique libraries and like online academies, and rather you want something more like Audible or Masterclass, try BJJ Mental Models Premium. We've got courses on concept, strategy, tactics, philosophy, mindset. We don't talk a lot about the techniques because I think audio is a better vehicle for talking about why you do things rather than the specifics. So if you want to dig in there, that's what you can do. You'll also get access to all of our premium podcasts, like The Highest Levels with Joe and our mutual coach, Emily Kwok. And also we've got a coaching tier where if you want direct coaching from our black belt review team, you can send in video clips of yourself rolling or even questions or feedback. And we've got a team of black belts around the world who will help you put together a game plan or give you detailed rolling feedback. I can almost assure you that this is probably going to be a higher caliber of black belt feedback than you'll get anywhere else. Our review team includes, Emily Kwok, for example, but Brianna St. Marie's on there. Marco Ciccarelli's on there. We've got some very, very high caliber athletes providing these breakdowns. And we also are looking now into business and marketing services. So if you are a gym owner or looking for another type of jiu-jitsu business and want a pattern after what we've done or want access to our toolkit, we've got a pro tier there. But I'll shut up now. Everything we make, the free stuff and the premium stuff, lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. So just go there one more time because I like to repeat, bjjmentalmodels.com.
Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you very much to all you folks listening. We will talk next week.
Peace.